The job ad was a ghost, a digital phantom I'd found in the deepest, dustiest corners of the internet. It wasn't on a mainstream job site, but on an obscure bulletin board for historical preservationists, a forum I hadn't visited since I dropped out of my master's program. Caretaker for a private, secluded estate. Duties involve routine maintenance and delivery of provisions. Discretion and fortitude essential. High compensation. It was vague to the point of being suspicious, but high compensation were the only two words my brain, drowning in student debt and the despair of a dead-end retail job, chose to register. The email exchange was curt. The phone interview was even shorter. A gravelly voice, old and measured, asked me if I was comfortable with isolation, if I was of sound mind and body, and if I could follow instructions without question. I said yes to all three, lying only slightly about the sound mind part. Who is, really, after 2 years of stocking shelves and dealing with irate customers over expired coupons? The voice, who introduced himself only as Thuron, told me a bus ticket would be wired to my email. It was one way to a town in central Pennsylvania I'd never heard of, Hemlock's Hollow. And that's how I found myself on a Greyhound, watching the Philadelphia skyline shrink into a smudge before being swallowed by the endless, rolling green of the Appalachians. The bus smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. I clutched my single duffel bag like a life raft, containing everything I owned that mattered. My laptop, a few changes of clothes, and a worn paperback of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, a relic from my college days when I thought philosophy could solve the world's problems. Now, I was just hoping it would solve my rent problem. The further we drove, the more the world outside the window seemed to recede in time. Gleaming highways devolved into two-lane country roads, flanked by dense, dark forests and the occasional rusted-out pickup truck in a weedy front yard. My cell service vanished an hour before we reached my stop. The bus hissed to a halt at a literal crossroads, marked only by a faded, splintered signpost. There was no station, no shelter, just me, my bag, and the oppressive humidity of a late summer afternoon. A plain, black sedan was parked on the gravel shoulder, looking as out of place as a tuxedo at a hoedown. The driver's door opened and a man emerged. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his 30s, with a severe haircut and a face that seemed incapable of expression. He wore simple gray trousers and a dark, button-down shirt. He didn't introduce himself, just nodded at me and took my bag, placing it in the trunk with an air of practiced efficiency. The drive was silent. He navigated the winding, poorly maintained mountain roads with a focus that was unnerving. The woods pressed in on either side, a wall of green and shadow, so thick that the afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy. After another 30 minutes, he turned onto an unpaved road that was little more than a pair of ruts in the dirt. The car bounced and jostled, and through the trees, I caught my first glimpse of the estate. It was no sprawling mansion. It was a monastery, or at least it looked like one. It was a grim, imposing collection of gray stone buildings, huddled together in a narrow valley as if for protection. A high stone wall encircled the entire compound, giving it the appearance of a medieval fortress. It didn't look like a place of peace or contemplation. It looked like a place built to keep something out, or perhaps to keep something in. We passed through a heavy iron gate, which the driver, whom I'd mentally named Brother Silence, closed and locked behind us. He led me across a cobblestone courtyard towards the largest building. The air here was different, cooler, damp, smelling of wet stone, moss, and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling, like old blood. Inside, the austerity was absolute. The walls were bare stone, the floors were worn wood, and the only light came from high, narrow windows. My footsteps echoed loudly in the cavernous silence. I was shown into a small, Spartan office. A simple wooden desk, 2 chairs. An old man stood waiting, his hands clasped behind his back. He was tall and gaunt, with a clean-shaven head and eyes the color of faded slate. It was the voice from the phone. Abbot Thuron. "Mr. Evans," he said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. "Welcome to the Priory of St. Jude the Forsaken. Please sit." I sat. Brother Silence remained standing by the door, a sentinel. "I trust your journey was uneventful," the abbot continued, though it wasn't a question. "As I explained, your duties here are simple, but require absolute adherence to our rules. You are here to provide a service. You will not ask questions about the nature of our work, our beliefs, or our charge." He paused, letting that word hang in the air. "Your primary duty is the delivery of sustenance, once a day, every day, at sundown." He gestured to the corner of the room where an industrial-sized metal bucket with a lid sat. "You will take a prepared meal down to the sub-croft. You will retrieve the empty container from the previous day. You will not speak. You will not attempt to look inside for any longer than is necessary to swap the containers. You will ensure the door is secure before you approach, and you will ensure it is triply secured before you leave. Is that clear?" "Triply secured?" I asked, my own voice sounding thin. "There are 3 locks. A bolt on the outside and 2 key locks. You will check them all, every time. This is not a request, Mr. Evans. It is the foundation of your employment. Your safety and ours depends on it." He didn't explain what the charge was. He referred to it as our ward, an afflicted soul the order had taken responsibility for centuries ago. The religious language was a veil, thin and translucent, barely hiding something far grimmer beneath. I was given a small, cell-like room with a bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the inner wall. The silence of the place was a physical weight. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange into the sky, the silent monk appeared at my door. He didn't speak, just beckoned. I followed him out of the main dormitory and towards an older, more squat section of the monastery, a part that seemed to grow directly from the mountain's bedrock. We descended a set of steep stone stairs into the cold, damp dark. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of mildew and something else. That same foul, coppery scent I'd noticed before, but stronger now. It was the smell of a butcher's shop left uncleaned for a week. We arrived in a small, stone-walled chamber, lit by a single, bare bulb dangling from a wire. Set into the far wall was a door. It was made of massive, dark oak planks, bound with thick straps of black iron. It looked ancient and immovable. 3 enormous locks were set into it, a heavy iron deadbolt and 2 large, complex-looking keyholes. Brother Silence handed me a heavy ring of iron keys and the bucket of food. The bucket was heavier than I expected. He then pointed to the door, gave a single, sharp nod, and retreated back up the stairs, his footsteps echoing until they vanished into silence. I was alone. The only sounds were the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I took a hesitant step forward, keys jangling in my trembling hand. That's when I heard it. A sound from behind the door. It wasn't a growl, not a roar. It was a low, guttural scraping, the sound of something heavy and wet being dragged across rough stone. It was followed by a ragged, choking cough, a sound of such profound and ancient misery that the hair on my arms stood on end. It was a sound that was not entirely animal and not quite human, but a horrifying fusion of the two. I stood frozen, the cold metal of the keys biting into my palm, the oppressive silence of the tomb pressing in on me, broken only by the sound of the wretch that waited on the other side. The sound echoed in the stone corridor, a thick, wet noise that vibrated through the soles of my shoes and settled deep in my gut. It was a sound of profound sickness, of a body laboring just to exist. My hand, holding the 3 heavy iron keys, trembled violently. Every instinct screamed at me to drop them, to run back up the winding stairs, out of the priory, and never look back. But the image of my mother's tired face, the stack of overdue bills on her kitchen table, was a chain just as strong as whatever lay behind that door. I was a prisoner here, too. Taking a ragged breath that tasted of dust and damp stone, I forced myself forward. The first lock was at eye level, a massive, ornate thing of black iron. The key was the largest of the 3, shaped like a grim scepter. It scraped as I pushed it in, the metal groaning in protest. Turning it required both hands and all the strength in my shoulders. With a deafening clunk, a bolt slid back within the door, the sound cannonballing down the hallway. 1 down. 2 to go. The second lock was at my waist, simpler, but no less formidable. The key turned with a series of grinding clicks, like the gears of a derelict clock being forced into motion. Another heavy thud echoed as the second bolt retracted. From inside, I heard a soft shuffling, a dry, scraping sound like old leather being dragged across gravel. It was closer now. It knew I was here. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. The final lock was near the floor. I had to kneel, my jeans soaking up the cold dampness from the flagstones. My hands were slick with sweat as I guided the last key into the keyhole. This one turned more easily, almost silently, which was somehow more unnerving. A soft click was the only confirmation. The door was unlocked. Abbot Thuron's words replayed in my mind. Open it only enough to pass the bucket through. Do not look inside. Do not linger. My hand rested on the cold iron ring that served as a handle. For a second, I couldn't move. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff in the dark. I didn't know what was in the abyss, but I could hear it breathing. Gritting my teeth, I pulled. The ancient hinges shrieked in agony. The door was impossibly heavy, and I opened it just a few inches, a sliver of deeper, more absolute darkness appearing in the gap. Then the smell hit me. It was a physical blow. A wave of suffocating odor that made me gag, my eyes watering instantly. It was the coppery tang of old blood, the cloying sweetness of rot, the sharp, acidic sting of ammonia, and underneath it all, a musky, primal scent of something ancient and carnivorous. It was the smell of a cage that hadn't been cleaned in 1,000 years. I shoved the bucket of slop forward with my foot, pushing it into the blackness. As it slid across the threshold, a shape moved in the dark. It was too fast to be a trick of the light. A pale limb, long and impossibly thin, snaked out from the shadows. It wasn't an arm. It looked more like the leg of an insect, but grotesquely swollen and covered in slick, yellowish skin. It moved with a sickening, disjointed twitch, the joints bending at unnatural angles. It ended not in a hand or a claw, but in a cluster of long, chitinous talons that scraped against the stone floor as it wrapped around the bucket and dragged it violently into the darkness. A low, guttural noise rumbled from within, a sound of what might have been satisfaction, followed by wet, rhythmic tearing and crunching. I didn't wait to hear more. I slammed the door shut with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength. The impact shuddered through the corridor. My hands flew to the locks, fumbling in my terror. Lock 1, click. Lock 2, clunk. I shoved the final, heaviest bolt home with a desperate grunt, the sound of its finality a small comfort in the suffocating dread. I scrambled back, stumbling and falling hard on the stone floor. I crab-walked away from the door, my chest heaving, until my back hit the opposite wall. I sat there, gasping for air that still tasted of decay, trying to erase the image of that limb from my mind. It wasn't just a creature. It felt like a violation of nature, something that had been torn from a reality of pure nightmare and imprisoned in hours. Eventually, my trembling subsided enough for me to get to my feet. I left the keys hanging from the top lock as instructed and walked, zombie-like, back up the stairs into the relative sanity of the monastery. As I emerged into the main cloister, I saw Brother Michael tending to the small herb garden in the center. He looked up, his face, usually placid, was etched with a deep, weary pity. He didn't say a word. He just gave me a slow, solemn nod before turning back to his plants. There was nothing to say. He knew, they all knew. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to eat the simple lunch of bread and soup they provided, but the memory of the smell made my stomach churn. I wandered the upper levels of the priory, trying to distract myself with the history etched into its walls. But every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like a dry, scraping whisper. The monks went about their duties with a grim, practiced stoicism. I saw it now for what it was, not peace, but resignation. They were wardens of a terrible secret, and the weight of it had crushed their spirits over generations. Their prayers, which I now heard echoing from the chapel almost constantly, didn't sound like worship. They sounded like a desperate vigil, a plea for strength against something that slept beneath their feet. That night, sleep offered no escape. I dreamt of a sliver of darkness and a pale, twitching limb reaching out for me. The first week bled into the second with a brutal, soul-crushing monotony. Time itself seemed to warp within the priory's stone walls, measured not in hours or days, but in the ringing of the bell that summoned me to my task. The initial, heart-pounding terror of that first feeding didn't vanish. It simply curdled, transforming from a sharp, stabbing panic into a dull, constant ache in the pit of my stomach. My hands, which had trembled so violently they could barely manage the keys, now performed the sequence with a numb, robotic efficiency. Turn the first key. Clank. Feel the weight of the bolt shift. Turn the second. Groan. The sound of metal grinding on ancient metal. Turn the third. Click. The final, quiet sound of release. Each time, the ritual was the same. The overpowering stench, a complex, layered odor of rot, rust, and something sickly sweet that clung to the back of my throat would billow out. I learned to hold my breath the moment my hand touched the final key. I no longer looked. My eyes would fixate on a specific stone on the floor just outside the threshold. I'd shove the bucket through the gap, my arm a piston of flesh and bone, and then the sickeningly fast scrape and thump as it was dragged into the abyss. I'd slam the door, my shoulder aching from the impact, and reverse the locking sequence. Only then would I allow myself to exhale, my lungs burning, the stale air of the corridor feeling impossibly fresh by comparison. I never saw the limb again, but I didn't need to. The image was seared onto the inside of my eyelids, a permanent guest in my nightmares. My fear was being eroded by a more dangerous emotion, curiosity. The historian in me, the part I thought I'd abandoned with my student loans and failed thesis, was stirring. Who were these monks, really? What was the history of this place, built like a fortress in the middle of nowhere? And what, in God's name, were they keeping behind that door? I began watching them, studying their routines beyond the prayer bells and silent meals. I saw the exhaustion in the slump of Abbot Thuron's shoulders, the deep-set lines of worry etched around Brother Michael's otherwise youthful eyes. One afternoon, I found Brother Michael in the small, windswept vegetable garden, patiently tying tomato vines to wooden stakes. The Appalachian air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was the most normal, peaceful scene I had witnessed since my arrival. I decided to take the chance. "Brother Michael," I started, my voice sounding rough from disuse. He looked up, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. He didn't seem surprised. "Leo, it is good to see you in the light. The sun is a blessing, is it not?" "It is," I agreed, trying to sound casual. "This place, it's incredible. The history must be immense. I studied history, you know, in college." He continued his work, his fingers nimble and sure. "A noble pursuit. Understanding the past can give context to the present." "That's what I was thinking," I pressed, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "This priory, it's not like others. The architecture is almost defensive. When was it built? Who was St. Jude the Forsaken?" Brother Michael paused his work. He looked at me, his gaze direct and filled with a profound sadness that made me feel like a naive child. "Some knowledge does not bring peace, my son. It only adds to the weight we must carry. Our founder believed that faith is not tested in comfort, but in adversity. Our duty is here, in the present. That is all that should concern you." He patted the soil around the base of a plant. "Focus on your work, do it well. There is a grace in simple, necessary tasks." The conversation was over. It was a gentle, polite dismissal, but a dismissal all the same. The wall was still there, impenetrable, built of piety and sorrow. Frustration gnawed at me. If he wouldn't give me answers, I would have to find them myself. My last resort was the Priory's library. It was not a grand, vaulted chamber, but a long, narrow room on the second floor. Two tall, arched windows, thick with dust, allowed thin beams of afternoon light to cut through the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust. The air was thick with the dry, vanilla scent of decaying paper and leather. Shelves stretched from the floor to the high ceiling, crammed with books of all sizes, leather-bound theological treatises, simple cloth-covered hymnals, and modern paperbacks on monastery management that seemed comically out of place. For days, I spent every spare moment there. It was a daunting task. The collection was a disorganized jumble, with no card catalog or system I could discern. I started where I could, pulling down any book that looked old or locally specific. I found histories of the Catholic Church in America, biographies of saints, and dense philosophical texts. It was all useless. My breakthrough came not from a place of scholarly insight, but from simple clumsiness. I was on a rickety wooden ladder, reaching for a thick, unlabeled ledger on the top shelf when my foot slipped. I flailed, my hand knocking the heavy volume next to it. The book, a dry-looking account of 19th century agricultural practices in Appalachia, tumbled from the shelf, hitting the floor with a loud thwump. It fell open, and something slipped from between its pages. A smaller, separate book, no bigger than my hand, bound in dark, cracked leather and tied shut with a brittle cord. My breath caught in my chest. I scrambled down the ladder, my knees shaking slightly. I knelt on the dusty floorboards and picked it up. It was a journal. The leather was worn smooth in places, and the cord crumbled to dust as I touched it. With trembling fingers, I eased the cover open. The pages were yellow and brittle, filled with a tight, spidery script in faded brown ink. A date was written on the first page, October 12, 1888. My eyes scanned the first few lines, and the blood ran cold in my veins. My name is Brother Alastair. I have been given the duty of keeper. The abbot tells me it is a holy charge, a penance for the sins of man. He is a liar. I have heard it scream. God have mercy on us, for what we keep in the dark is no man at all. The library was a tomb of forgotten words, and I felt like a grave robber. My only light was a battery-powered lantern I'd scavenged from a supply closet, casting a stark white circle on the small, leather-bound journal. The air was frigid, smelling of dust and decaying paper, a scent that now seemed to mirror the very secret I was uncovering. My hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the terrifying vindication of Alastair's first scrawled lines. A lie, it was all built on a lie. I turned the brittle page, my breath catching in my throat. The ink was faded, the cursive elegant but rushed, the writing of a man desperate to record a truth he could speak to no one. October 12, 1888. The man they brought today is named Silas. He comes from a small settlement down in the valley, ravaged by a lung affliction that turns the breath to fire and the skin to ash. He is the last of his family. He begged Abbot Gregory for the priory's legendary Mountain's Mercy, a cure spoken of only in whispers. The abbot, in his wisdom and piety, has agreed. Silas has been given a room in the infirmary. His coughing echoes in the stone halls. It is a human sound. I pray we can help him. Silas, the creature had a name. My mind recoiled from the thought. The shriek that tore through the stone, the monstrous pale limb that had snatched the bucket that had once been a man named Silas. A sick man looking for a cure. I felt a wave of nausea, imagining the hope in his eyes as he arrived, the trust he placed in the monks. I flipped forward, scanning pages of observations about Silas's worsening condition, Alastair's notes growing more concerned. November 4th, 1888. The abbot's remedy is not working as I had believed. He has moved Silas from the infirmary to the old foundations, to the very room where we now keep him. The treatment, a poultice of crushed nightshade and a tincture distilled from a strange, phosphorescent moss that grows only in the deepest caves, has wrought a terrible change. His skin has taken on a waxy, pale quality, and his limbs seem pliable. Wrong. Yesterday he spoke, but his words were not words. They were a string of guttural clicks and a long, high-pitched keen that made my teeth ache. Abbot Gregory insists it is the illness being purged, a necessary and violent exorcism of the flesh. He calls it the cleansing. I call it monstrous. I had to put the journal down. I pressed the heels of my palms into my eyes, trying to erase the image of the limb I'd seen, its unnatural flexibility suddenly, horribly explained. This wasn't a divine trial. It was a medical experiment gone hideously wrong. These monks weren't guarding a demon, they were concealing a catastrophic failure, a sin of pride and misguided faith passed down through generations. The weight of their secret was no longer a mystery, but a tangible human tragedy. The fortress wasn't to keep something evil in, it was to keep their shame hidden from the world. My fingers, slick with sweat, found the journal again. I skipped ahead, drawn to a series of entries where the ink was spattered, the handwriting nearly illegible with haste and terror. December 21st, 1888. It happened. God forgive us, it happened. During the feeding, the leather restraints, already weakened by its constant, twitching strain, finally gave way. Brother Thomas was too slow. The thing that was Sela's threw him against the stone wall. The sound will never leave me. It did not use its hands. It was a blow from its shoulder, a movement like a battering ram, impossibly fast. We managed to secure the outer door just as it lunged for the opening. Its shrieks of rage were no longer just sound. They felt like a physical force against the wood. Brother Thomas is gone. The abbot led us in a prayer for his soul, but his eyes were the eyes of a man staring into a hell of his own making. Tomorrow, they will bring the iron and the chains. This was it, the reason for the 3 heavy locks, the solid steel door, the almost pathological adherence to the rules. It wasn't about an ancient evil. It was about Brother Thomas. It was about a memory of violence so profound it had been forged into the priory's very architecture. I felt a strange, cold kinship with Alistair. I, too, had felt that fear standing before the door. I, too, had felt the unnatural power radiating from within. He wasn't just a voice from the past, he was a mirror of my own terror. I was nearing the end of the journal. The final few pages were warped, stained with what looked like water or perhaps tears. The last entry was dated nearly a month after the previous one. January 18th, 1889. The silence is worse than the screaming. For days, it has been quiet. I fear it is plotting or dying. Today, it was my turn to clean the antechamber. As I worked my back to the inner door's slot, a profound pity washed over me. Not for the beast, but for the man it had devoured. Without thinking, my heart crying out for the soul we had destroyed, I whispered his name. Just once. Silas. The scratching from within stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any before. I held my breath, my blood turning to ice. I thought I had made a fatal error. And then, from the suffocating darkness beyond the slot, a sound came. It was not a shriek or a snarl. It was a wet, gurgling rasp, an agonizing attempt to shape air into a word. It was a mimicry, a grotesque echo of my own voice. SSSI Lus, it knows its name. Or some ghost of the man trapped within the monster knows it. I do not know if this is a key to his salvation or a path to our damnation. The abbot must never know. This knowledge feels more dangerous than the creature itself. I cannot write anymore. That was the last entry. The rest of the pages were blank. I slammed the journal shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent library. I sat there, the lantern light bleaching the color from my face, my mind racing. The creature, the monster, the thing in the dark, it responded. There was a remnant of a person in there. A person twisted and broken and imprisoned for over a century. Alistair was terrified of the discovery. He saw it as a spiritual burden, a dangerous secret. But I wasn't a monk bound by faith and fear of damnation. I was a history student buried in debt, a desperate man who had stumbled into a living nightmare. And for the first time, I saw a path that wasn't just enduring or escaping. A terrible, reckless, and utterly necessary idea began to form in my mind, taking root in the fertile ground of Alistair's last, terrifying words. I had to know more, I had to test it. Tomorrow, at the feeding, I wouldn't just deliver the bucket, I would speak his name. The weight of the name, Silas, was a physical thing. It sat heavy in my chest, a stone of knowledge that made every breath a conscious effort. The Priory, once a place of intimidating silence, now felt like it was screaming at me. Every toll of the bell was a countdown. Every shuffling step of a brown-robed monk in the hallway was a reminder of the secret they guarded, the lie they lived. Alastair's journal was tucked back in its hiding place, but its words were seared into my brain. The routine I had fallen into, the one that had numbed my terror, was now an instrument of torture. I wasn't just delivering a meal. I was walking toward a moment that could either break me or break through to whatever remained of the man named Silas. The day was cold and damp, a classic Appalachian autumn day where the fog clung to the stone walls like a shroud. The air felt thin in my lungs as I walked through the cloister towards the kitchen. Brother Michael handed me the heavy bucket, his eyes holding the same familiar, placid sorrow. Today, however, I saw it differently. It wasn't just piety, it was a profound, inherited weariness. Did he know the name? Did he know the story? Or did he just know the duty, the unending penance of guarding the failed experiment of his predecessors? "Be careful, Leo," he said, his voice as gentle as always. It was the same thing he said every day. "I will, brother," I replied, my own voice feeling foreign tight. The keys felt heavier today, their metallic chill seeping through my palm. Each step down the stone corridor towards the containment wing was a battle. My legs wanted to lock up, to turn and run back to the library, back to the world of debt and exams that now seemed like a laughable paradise. But my feet kept moving forward, propelled by a reckless, terrifying curiosity. Alastair had felt this. He had stood before this same door, holding this same terrible knowledge. He had whispered the name. Now it was my turn. I reached the door. The air here was always colder, stagnant with the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something acrid and primal. The usual sounds were there, a wet, guttural breathing, the scrape of something hard against stone. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the monstrous sounds from within. I set the bucket down, my hands trembling as I selected the first key. The sound of the iron bolt sliding back was deafening in the charged silence of the corridor. I took a deep, shaky breath that tasted of dust and dread. The second key. The bolt shot home with a painful clang. 2. My mind was screaming at me, just feed it. Lock the door, walk away. Forget the name, but I couldn't, I had to know. The final lock. 3. I paused, my hand on the small, barred opening. Inside, the scraping grew more agitated, the breathing more ragged. It knew food was coming. My plan felt insane, the ramblings of a man pushed to the edge. I grabbed the handle of the bucket, pulled the door open just enough to slide it through, and pushed it into the oppressive darkness. The stench hit me like a physical blow. As always, a pale, multi-jointed limb, thick as a tree branch and slick with some foul fluid, shot out from the gloom and snatched the bucket, dragging it violently out of sight. The usual cacophony of slurping, tearing, and crunching began. My moment was now. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted. I leaned closer to the opening, the cold iron pressing against my forehead. The sounds of feeding were horrific, but I forced myself to listen, to wait for a lull. It came, a brief pause in the carnage, punctuated by a deep, wet gasp for air. "Silas," I whispered. The name was barely a breath, a ghost of a sound swallowed by the stone corridor. Everything stopped. The tearing, the crunching, the slurping, all of it ceased instantly. The silence that fell was absolute, a sudden void of sound so profound it was more terrifying than the noise it replaced. It was a listening silence, an aware silence. My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, pinned in place by the sheer weight of that sudden, attentive stillness. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, a new sound came from the darkness. It wasn't a roar or a screech. It was a low, guttural vibration, a wet, drawn-out croak that sounded disturbingly like an attempt to mimic the shape of the word I had spoken. It was a sound of immense effort, of ruined vocal cords trying to form a word they hadn't shaped in over a century. It was the most horrifying and human sound I had ever heard. Panic, pure and absolute, seized me. I slammed the door shut, the iron groaning in protest. My hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the keys. I jammed them into the locks, ramming the bolts home with frantic, clumsy force. 1, 2, 3. Only when the final bolt was secure did I allow myself to breathe, collapsing back against the opposite wall, sliding down to the cold floor. My entire body shook uncontrollably. It was true. It was all true. That thing in the dark wasn't just a monster. It was Silas, and he knew his name. I don't know how long I sat there before I managed to get my legs to work. I stumbled back towards the main part of the priory, my mind a whirlwind of terror and a strange, triumphant exhilaration. I had made contact. Later that afternoon, I found Brother Michael tending to the small herb garden in the cloister, his back to me as he gently pruned a rosemary bush. I needed to know what he knew. I had to be careful. "Brother Michael," I said, my voice still shaky. He turned, a calm, questioning look on his face. "Leo, is everything all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just thinking. I was reading in the library earlier. About the priory's history. It mentioned the monks here used to offer more than just spiritual sanctuary, medical care for travelers and the locals." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "That is true. In the past, we served the communities of these mountains in many ways." I took a breath, choosing my next words with surgical precision. "Were there ever any difficult cases? Patients who perhaps stayed on long-term, whose treatments may not have gone as planned?" A shadow passed over Brother Michael's face. It was fleeting but unmistakable. A deep, ancient sadness. He turned his gaze from me to the gray, imposing mountains that surrounded us. "God's path for a soul is not always clear, Leo," he said, his voice soft, yet heavy with unspoken meaning. "And man's attempts to alter that path can lead to profound sorrow. We pray for all the souls who have sought refuge within these walls. Some burdens," he added, finally looking back at me, "are meant to be carried for generations." He knew. He didn't know the specifics, maybe not even the name, but he knew. He knew their charge was not a holy ward, but a tragic inheritance. A penance. I stood there, the cold afternoon air biting at my skin, and I understood. I had not just poked a monster. I had disturbed a tomb. The conversation with Brother Michael had settled in my bones like the ever-present Appalachian chill. It wasn't just a confirmation of my suspicions, it was an indictment. The monks weren't ignorant wardens. They were penitents, serving a sentence passed down through generations. They knew, on some level, what they were guarding. And their sorrow wasn't for the monster in the cell, but for the sin that created him. The weight of that legacy now felt, impossibly, like it was settling on my shoulders too. Fear was still a constant companion, but it had changed its shape. It was no longer the sharp, panicked terror of the first few weeks. Now, it was a low, heavy dread, the kind that comes with responsibility. The guttural croak that answered my whisper of Silas had forged a connection I couldn't sever. I had proven a hypothesis. There was a mind in that darkness, a flicker of the man he once was. What was I supposed to do with that knowledge? Walk away when my contract was up, leaving him to an eternity of silent suffering? The thought was a fresh kind of horror. Communication had to be the next step. Not with words, that was too much, too soon, but with something tangible. An offering. The next afternoon, before my scheduled duty, I walked through the priory's austere vegetable garden. The wind cut through my thin jacket, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. I scanned the ground, bypassing sharp, broken bits of shale until my eyes landed on a perfect stone. It was smooth and flat, a dark gray oval worn down by a forgotten river, sitting coolly in my palm. It was nothing, and it was everything. It couldn't be used as a weapon. It had no purpose other than to simply be. An object for a mind starved of stimulus. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood before the door later that day. The 3 locks felt heavier, each turn of the key a conscious decision. This wasn't routine anymore. It was an experiment, and the stakes felt terrifyingly high. I slid the food bucket into the opening, my hand trembling slightly. "Silas," I whispered into the foul-smelling darkness. The name was a fragile thing in the oppressive silence. The frantic, wet sounds of eating began, ravenous and desperate as always. But then, just as before, they stopped. A profound, listening silence filled the void. It was so absolute I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I took a steadying breath. "I brought you something," I said, my voice barely audible. I gently placed the smooth gray stone on the floor, about a foot from the bucket. My fingers recoiled from the cold, grimy stone floor as if it had burned me. Then I waited, holding my breath, my ear pressed near the gap. For several long seconds, there was nothing but the sound of his breathing, a ragged, wet inhalation that seemed too shallow for such a large being. Then I heard it. Not the crash of it being thrown against a wall or the crunch of it being shattered. It was a soft, deliberate scrape. The sound of stone being dragged slowly across stone. It was a curious sound, an investigative one. Another scrape, closer this time. Then silence again, followed by the resumption of the frantic eating. My mind reeled. He hadn't destroyed it. He had examined it. Before I could process the implications, I knew I'd lingered too long. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed the heavy door shut, the sound echoing my own racing heartbeat. I fumbled with the locks, my hands shaking, and retreated down the corridor. The image of that simple stone being nudged across the floor burning in my mind. My change in behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. 2 days later, Brother Michael approached me after my duties. "The abbot wishes to see you, Leo," he said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. There was a note of warning in his quiet voice. Abbot Thuron's office was as severe as the man himself. A single, tall window looked out onto the gray, unforgiving mountainside. The only adornments were a simple wooden crucifix on the wall and a bookshelf filled with identical, leather-bound theological texts. The air was cold and still. He gestured for me to sit in the hard wooden chair opposite his desk, then folded his hands, his long, pale fingers interlaced. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice calm and devoid of warmth. "You have been with us for several weeks now. You have performed your duties adequately." I nodded, unsure of where this was heading. "I try my best, Abbot." "Your duties are simple," he continued, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "They require punctuality and discretion. They do not, however, require improvisation. They do not require emotional investment." Ice flooded my veins. He knew. I didn't know how he knew, if he'd been watching me on a hidden camera I hadn't found, or if my lingering at the door had been timed and noted. But he knew. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Curiosity is a dangerous vanity, Leo," he said, using my first name for the first time. It felt less like an intimacy and more like a warning shot. This priory has stood for over a century by adhering to a sacred, unchanging discipline. The rules are not arbitrary. They are the bedrock of our safety, of your safety. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "The man who held your position before you, he grew complacent. He began to think he understood the nature of our ward. He believed he could manage it better than generations of his predecessors. That mistake cost him dearly." His words hung in the air, a clear, unmistakable threat. He wasn't talking about the monk Alistair wrote about. He was talking about my immediate predecessor. The vague story I'd been told about him, leaving suddenly, now felt like a lie. "Your task is to feed the ward. Nothing more," Thuron said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. "You are not to attempt communication. You are not to interact. You are not to seek knowledge that does not concern you. Do you understand me? Your continued employment here, your very presence within these walls, depends entirely on your ability to follow these simple instructions." I could only nod, my throat tight. "Yes, Abbot, I understand." "Good," he said, leaning back, the audience clearly over. "Do not make me regret placing my trust in you." I walked out of his office and back into the cold, silent hallway feeling completely exposed. I was trapped. On one side of a door was a being I was now certain was a man who had responded to the first glimmer of human contact in possibly a century. On the other side was the absolute, unyielding authority of the priory, embodied by an abbot who would cast me out, or worse, without a moment's hesitation. The smooth, gray stone was no longer a symbol of hope. It was evidence of a crime I had already committed. Abbot Thuron's warning clung to me like the damp Appalachian chill, a constant, oppressive weight. Every creak of the priory's old floorboards sounded like his approaching footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold his condemning gaze. I knew my time was limited, that one more misstep would not just mean dismissal, but being cast out into the wilderness with a secret that would haunt me forever. My curiosity had become a liability, my compassion a crime. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, under the weak light of my desk lamp, I returned to Alastair's journal, my last and only guide. I scanned the brittle pages not for tales of horror, but for a final sliver of hope, a detail I might have missed in my haste. My fingers traced the elegant, faded script describing Sela's before the change. Alastair wrote of the man's life in the small, now-vanished logging town of Hemlock's Hollow. And there, tucked into a description of Sela's gentle nature, was the detail I'd overlooked. A single, poignant sentence. He had a gift for shaping wood and would often sit on his porch, carving small birds from fallen branches for the town's children. A simple joy now lost to the ages. It wasn't a name, it was an identity, a craft, a memory of hands that once created, now only capable of destroying. A desperate, foolish plan began to form in my mind. It was a monumental risk, a direct violation of Thuron's command, but it was the only thing I had left. The next day, on my way back from the library, I feigned a stumble near a withered oak tree at the edge of the cloister garden. My hands shot out, not to break my fall, but to snatch a small, fallen branch, no thicker than my wrist. I concealed it in my jacket, my heart hammering against my ribs. Later, I found what I needed near the crumbling foundation of an old outbuilding. A sharp-edged piece of flint, its edge jagged enough to score wood. It was a pathetic substitute for a carver's knife, but it would have to do. My final walk to Sela's cell felt like a march to my own execution. The weight of the 3 keys in my hand was immense, each one a link in a chain of misery that stretched back over a century. The air in the corridor was colder than ever, the silence profound. I could feel the abbot's presence, a phantom breathing down my neck. I performed the ritual one last time, the sound of each heavy lock turning echoing like a death knell. I pushed the food slot open. The familiar, wretched smell washed over me. I shoved the bucket of raw meat inside, my hands shaking. Then, taking a deep breath, I pushed the piece of oak and the sharp flint through the opening, letting them clatter softly onto the stone floor. I whispered his name, just once, a prayer into the darkness. Sela's. I expected the usual frenzy of tearing flesh and snapping bone, but it never came. Instead, after a long, tense silence, a different sound reached me. Not a growl, not a shriek, but a soft, rhythmic scraping. It was a hesitant, almost curious sound. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. I leaned closer, my ear pressed near the cold iron, forgetting everything but the impossible noise from within. I had to see. I crouched lower, trying to peer through the narrow slot. Mr. Hayes. The voice was like a blade of ice down my spine. I froze, my body going rigid. I slowly rose and turned. Abbot Thuron stood at the end of the hall, his form a towering silhouette against the distant archway window. He wasn't running. He walked with a slow, deliberate menace that was far more terrifying. Brother Michael was a few steps behind him, his face a mask of pity and regret. "Your curiosity has finally gotten the better of you," Thuron said, his voice dangerously calm as he closed the distance between us. His eyes were flinty, devoid of all mercy. "I gave you a simple task, a sacred duty, and you have defiled it with your sentimentality." He reached for my arm, his grip like a vice. "You are finished here. Brother Michael will see you out." "Wait," I croaked, my voice cracking. It was a pathetic plea, but I had to try. "Please, just look." "Listen," Thuron scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Look at what? The monster you've agitated, the beast you've treated like a pet. He's not a beast." The words tore from my throat, raw with a conviction I didn't know I possessed. He was a man. His name was Silas. Just look. The rhythmic scraping from the cell continued, soft but persistent. It was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the corridor. Thuron's eyes flickered from my face to the iron door. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or a sliver of morbid curiosity, crossing his hardened features. He held my arm for a moment longer, then released me with a shove. He stepped to the door and bent down, his posture rigid with contempt, clearly intending to prove me a fool. He peered into the darkness. For a long moment, he was perfectly still. The scraping stopped. I held my breath, fearing the worst. Then, a pale, unnaturally long-fingered hand moved into the thin sliver of light visible through the slot. It wasn't snatching or clawing. It was holding the piece of oak. With agonizing slowness, the creature used the sharp stone to drag a line across the wood's surface. What lay on the floor was crude, barely recognizable, a child's clumsy etching. But the shape was undeniable. A rough, angled body. A small, rounded head. A suggestion of a wing. It was a bird. The abbot straightened up slowly, his face ashen. The fury was gone, replaced by a profound, bottomless shock that seemed to shatter his stony composure. His gaze was distant, lost, as if he were staring back through a century of his predecessors, seeing not a monster to be caged, but a soul to be mourned. The silence in the hallway was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. He did not look at me. He turned his head slightly toward Brother Michael, his voice no longer a whip crack of authority, but a hollow, weary whisper. His service here is concluded. See him to the gate. Brother Michael nodded silently and gestured for me to follow. As we walked away, I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I had seen the crack in the fortress, not of stone, but of dogma. At the main gate, the cool mountain air felt like a release. Brother Michael handed me an envelope with my final payment. His usual placid expression was gone, replaced by something deeply troubled. For generations, we have guarded the sin, he said, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his words. We fed the monster, and in doing so, we forgot the man. You didn't. He looked past me, toward the high stone walls of the priory, a prison for its keepers as much as its captive. Pray for him, Mr. Hayes, he said softly, and pray for us. I took the envelope and walked away without another word. Driving down the winding mountain road, the cash in my pocket felt meaningless. It wasn't the solution to my debt. It was the fee for a terrible, sacred knowledge. I glanced in my rearview mirror at the stone towers shrinking in the distance. I would never know if Silas's life would truly change. I didn't know if he would ever see the sun, or if the monks would simply continue their vigil with a heavier heart. But I knew that for one brief, impossible moment, I had broken the chain. I had not freed the prisoner, but I had revealed the man. And in the suffocating silence of that ancient priory, I had made them see him, too.